Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Professor Kezia Dugdale, Associate Director of the Centre for Public Policy here at the University of Glasgow. The Centre was established just over 2 years ago as a convening space, a space to bring together academics, policymakers and practitioners to help tackle the many complex and interconnected challenges facing government and the communities they serve. Today we turn that expertise and that understanding to the outcome of last Thursday's Scottish Parliament elections. Our panel will unpack the results, explore the political and policy implications, and consider what any shifts in public sentiment might mean for our government in the months ahead. During the election campaign, the Centre has been doing a power of work to support informed debate and provide expert analysis on key developments. This has included our weekly Spotlight episodes, the most recent of which we've just recorded with Graham Roy from the Scottish Fiscal Commission and Kate Higgins, who's been at the heart of the SNP government as a special advisor from 2015 until last Thursday. That will be available from Wednesday morning of this week, so make sure you're subscribed so that it drops into your podcast feeds as soon as it's available. We've also been publishing a series of policy insights on some of the most pressing challenges facing the next Scottish Government, like migration, the economy, education, with more on health and council tax and so many other issues to come in the coming days. And we've also published a very handy at-a-glance guide to the manifestos. It was useful last week in terms of determining what your votes were, and it might be useful this week in terms of determining which issues the various parties can work together on. You can find information about all of these activities and more on the Centre for Public Policy's website, and please do get in touch with us directly if you'd like to learn more about our work. Today, though, we're delighted to bring you expert analysis of the election results, and we've got 3 first-class speakers for you to do just that. They'll each offer their own opening thoughts before taking your questions. So if you are watching live on YouTube, you can pose your question in the chat bar there. Alternatively, we're also using Slido. To pose your question there, go to slido.com and then enter the code that you can see running along the bottom of your screen. We are also in LinkedIn and Blue Sky, so if you prefer to use that format, please pop your questions onto those formats, and there's a whole team of folk behind the scenes here at the Centre for Public Policy who will scrape together all those questions and make sure I've got them in front of me. So now on to our speakers. First up, we're going to hear from Nicola McEwen, who is a Professor of Public Policy and Governance and Director of the Centre for Public Policy at the University of Glasgow. Nicola has published widely in the field of territorial politics, nationalism, multi-level government and policymaking, and of course, elections. She'll then be followed by Chris Carman, who is the Stevenson Professor of Citizenship here at the University of Glasgow. And Chris's research focuses on political representation and its alternatives, such as public petition systems, political processes, elections and electoral processes, public opinion and public policy. And then we'll hear from Mark McGeoghegan, who is an Associate Advisory Director at Ipsos UK, a Research Associate here at the Centre for Public Policy, and an Associate Member of the Centre on Constitutional Change. First up, though, we're going to hear from Professor Nicola McEwen.
Thank you very much, Kez, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. So I'm going to give just a quick overview of where I see the lay of the land in terms of winners and losers before I hand over to my colleagues to look more in depth at some of these issues. So it's clear that the main winner was quite obviously the SNP, with a 5th successive term for an SNP government, which is a remarkable achievement in any context, and in particular in the context of a competitive 6-party system and a track record that was perhaps not judged all that favourably by the electorate. That 5th successive term is not an achievement that's been secured ever by any party of UK government. Now, its 58 seats are not as many as the SNP had hoped for, but also there weren't as many losses as they had feared. The drop in support for the SNP on the regional list vote meant that the marginal contests in constituencies were always going to matter. They won some, they did well to maintain their support in the northeast, but losses in the Highlands and Islands will hurt. I have to say, one of my bugbears in a lot of the commentary in the run-up to the election and in the aftermath of it is around what seems to be an obsession with single-party majorities. Single-party majorities are extraordinarily rare in proportional representation systems. And the focus on that seems to underline for me that we still have a long way to go to get away from the majoritarian culture of Westminster towards a European democracy where minority and coalition is the norm and not a sign of failure. There were other winners, of course. The Greens' decision to concentrate resources on a few constituencies and concentrate on the regional list vote elsewhere has helped them gain their best performance to date since devolution by some distance. And of course, the combined seats of the SNP and the Greens of 73 represents the largest pro-independence majority to date. And perhaps we'll come back to that, what that may mean, if anything, in the discussion. Liberal Democrats were sort of winners. They typically benefited from a concentration of support in key constituencies and did particularly well in the Highlands. They are not quite at the heights of the early years of devolution before the Liberal Democrats at the UK level entered the coalition government with the Conservatives and faced electoral repercussions of that in the elections that followed, including in Scotland. And they still finished in sixth place, but now at least they're entitled to representation in the all-important Parliamentary Bureau. And Alex Cole-Hamilton's constant plea for Liberal Democrat votes on the peach ballot, including going so far as to don a peach suit the day before the election, may have helped them pick up a couple of more list seats in this election. But constituencies are usually the Liberal Democrat strength, and so it was also in this election too. And of course, the other clear winner is Reform UK, going from nowhere to second place with a 16.6% vote share, which is marginally higher than the vote share for the Labour Party on the regional list, although not in the constituencies, and with the same number of seats. That has led to a little bit of back and forth between Reform and Labour about who gets to go first, who should be second place in terms of questions in the chamber. But there are no extra privileges. There is no official opposition in the Scottish Parliament. The Scottish Parliament is not a mini Westminster, even if sometimes its members might act like it. But I expect the presiding officer, who will be elected later this week, will give these parties turn around at going first in First Minister's questions. But as I said, there is no official opposition status in the Scottish Parliament. I think a key challenge for the Reform leadership will be, is this a cohesive, disciplined parliamentary grouping? Will Malcolm Offord be able to command leadership of his group? And will they represent a constructive force in the Parliament, perhaps representing voices that maybe haven't felt heard by others? Or will they be disruptors, racist, undermining devolution at every turn? And we just don't know what the nature of that group will be yet, and I expect there will be a lot of diversity within it. There were two clear losers in this election. The Conservative Party lost half of its support and fell from second place in the last two elections to fifth place in this one. And in both the constituency and the regional list, it represents the worst ever performance in Scotland in any election in its history, surpassing even its previous worst ever electoral performance, which was in the 2024 UK general election. So these are deeply worrying times for the Conservative Party. But I want to focus the remaining remarks on the Labour Party. Now, again, this was also the worst ever performance for the Labour Party in a Scottish Parliament election. Its constituency vote share was marginally better than its worst ever constituency performance in a general election, which was in 2019. But the party list vote share at 16% is the worst ever performance in its history. Should the blame for that be laid at Keir Starmer's door, as the narrative suggests? I know that Chris is going to explore some of those narratives in more detail. For my part, some of it, for sure, does lie in Downing Street. But I think the Scottish Party should be looking at itself too. Labour hasn't won more than 20% in the list vote since 2011, and yet it had no list vote strategy in this election, despite it being patently obvious that the Labour Party would be relying on list votes for most of its representation. In the campaign, there was a demand for change without a plan for change, a focus on changing the leaders without being clear what difference that would make and how it would make things better. And a steadfast determination to make this an election on the SNP's record in government, whilst failing to recognise that devolved government doesn't take place in a vacuum. It will always be shaped by wider events and developments firth of Scotland. And it's also always going to be shaped by the constitutional framework. There is a gap between independence and the union as currently constituted that can help to defend and strengthen Scottish self-government, but there's no interest from the party of devolution in occupying that space. And I think Labour's previous dominance of Scottish politics in the early part of this century and for the latter half of the previous one, and its recovery in 2024, have perhaps left the party with an expectation of, and perhaps even a sense of entitlement to govern, or to be the government in waiting when in opposition. But the arithmetic of these and recent previous Scottish Parliament elections results suggest a different story. All of which begs the question, is there an alternative party of government to the SNP in the Scottish Parliament? The party was re-elected despite voter dissatisfaction with public services, despite dissatisfaction with the SNP's performance, despite a belief that the country is going in the wrong direction, and despite evident leadership and financial problems that were on full display during the last term, at least before John Swinney assumed office. Those are normally conditions that would prompt a change of government, or at least a closer contest than the one that we have just had. And whilst the vote share of what we might see as a pro-union, anti-independence bloc was greater than the combined vote share of the pro-independence SNP and Greens, party politics and voter choices aren't all about the Constitution. And while, as Mark will explain, constitutional preferences still shape voting behaviour, elections are not constitutional referenda. So from this vantage point, it's difficult to foresee a future Scottish election producing a winning coalition where arithmetic and ideological alignment would be sufficient to form a credible alternative. But turning back finally to this election, the SNP is now further away from a majority than in the last session, but in a parliament of minorities, it has substantially greater representation than anyone else, and that should make it easier to get the key business done. The ideological fragmentation across the opposition benches may make it harder for the opposition to unite against the government. And some parties seem more keen than others to use the opportunities of minority government to get policy concessions. But there is also a geographic fragmentation. The constituency losses that the SNP suffered, combined with its weakness on the regional list, means that the government now has no representation in the borders and much more limited representation in the Highlands and Islands, notwithstanding Shetland. And I think the new government will need to be mindful of that when seeking to govern for the whole of Scotland. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicola. Fantastic reminder of everything that's happened over the past few days and also what lies ahead into the future. Most politicians and party political activists got some respite over the weekend, a chance to put their feet up after 6 weeks of hard, short campaigning. But that wasn't the case for the Scottish Election Study. You only really got to work this weekend. Is that not the case, Chris Carman? We're delighted to welcome you to talk us through the early details of the number crunching that you and your colleagues at the Scottish Election Study have been doing to really explain what's been going on in the minds of Scots. Take it away.
Thanks, Kez. Yes, we are pretty much getting started. We had to get the pre-election survey in the field, which is what I will use in this discussion. But we're now going into the field with the post-election, which will probably be one of the more revealing ones. But what I plan to do here is to address or test two of the predominant narratives that have developed in the wake of the election result. And I'm going to do that with the pre-election survey from the Scottish election study. So that was a cross-sectional weekly design where we interviewed about 1,000 people every week during the formal campaign period. So it's quite a rich data set that we can use to look at the motivations that people gave us when they were going into the polling place. And then the last thing I'm going to do is look at the challenges that Nicola was touching on there going forward. So first narrative is this UK-focused. Voters were thinking about the UK or British level politics rather than thinking about Scottish politics. And we just had Lord McConnell over the weekend writing in the Times that the public's disappointment with the UK government was stronger than anger at the state of the Scottish Health Service. So in the pre-election survey, we asked voters, in deciding how to vote in Scottish Parliament elections, do you decide on the basis of mostly Scottish or mostly British politics and issues? And about just shy of 60% of our respondents said that it really is Scottish issues that they were thinking about when they were deciding how they were going to cast their ballot. And about 29% of respondents said that it was mostly British issues. So it's about a 2-to-1 ratio between thinking about Scotland, which is clearly the dominant thing in most voters' minds, or mainly thinking about British issues. Now, you can imagine that this does break down differently by party. And sure enough, the three sort of traditional unionist parties, Labour, Lib Dems, and Conservatives, about in the mid-60s percent of people who were going to cast a ballot for those parties said that they were thinking mostly about Scottish issues. Not surprisingly, about 73% of people saying that they were going to vote for the SNP said that they would vote for on the basis of Scottish issues. But the Reform Party is the standout exception here. People who said that they were going to vote Reform, about 55% said that they were voting mostly on British politics and British-based issues. Now, you might think, okay, well, that must be because of the idea that Labour supporters had jumped ship and they were upset with the British government, and that's what was driving that. That's not the case. So I looked at people who said that they voted for Labour in 2021 and then 2024, or 2021 or 2024. And they're about 50-50 on the Scottish British issues. It's the people who voted for Reform in 2024, but hadn't previously voted for Labour, who said that they were really thinking about British issues. That's the group that really drives it. So it's not the case that it was just Labour people jumping ship there. So a mixed message there, but most people thinking about Scottish issues, some particularly Reform supporters thinking about British issues. The next narrative, the meh election narrative. If you've paid any attention to podcasts, broadcasts, print media, and if you're watching this webinar, you probably have, you've heard this narrative that it was a very boring, bland election that failed to engage voters. So what does our Scottish election study data tell us? Yeah, that one's pretty much right. If we look at sort of 4 different measures that we often use to measure sort of engagement with the campaign and campaign dynamics amongst the public, that is satisfaction with democracy in Scotland, the vote likelihood, how certain people are to say that they will turn out to vote on election day, vote certainty, that is vote choice certainty, how certain are they of the choice that they are going to make, and just interest in the election. How interested are they in the election? Those all flatlined across the entire election campaign. No movement. Even the debates didn't move them. So yeah, it doesn't look like the election really engaged people. We didn't see this going up. Now you might say, okay, maybe that happened in the long campaign beforehand, but going back away in our survey to back to February, it doesn't look like that's the case. But that's not to say that there wasn't some movement in the campaign. And here's where it gets a little interesting. Where the parties started off in week 1 is not where they finished in week 4. So this is a cross-sectional, so this isn't a panel study. This is 1,000 people, 1,000 people, 1,000 people, 1,000 people in each week, telling us how they intended to vote. And what you find is that over the course of the 4-week campaign, SNP slipped a little bit. You'll see that Labour actually popped up a little bit in that 4th week. Labour went up a wee bit. Over the course of the four weeks, the Greens lost vote, looking at the list votes. The Lib Dems were the only party to show a statistically significant climb, actually, over the entire period. And Reform basically ended up where they started, with a little bump at week 3, but you might think that the House's boats and cars debate maybe sort of suppressed their numbers in week 4. Now, I did a little thought experiment of, well, does the campaign really matter then? And if you look at where the parties were in week 1, and you say, okay, let's say, what would if we applied that as a uniform swing on the election result in the different constituencies? What you find is that the SNP, if the numbers were as they had been in week 1, would have ended up on 3 constituencies better off than they did. So it's a rough thought experiment. It applies the uniform swing, and it doesn't take into campaign differentials and incumbency across those constituencies. But it does look like the campaign mattered at the margins. And as Mark, I think we'll come on to talking about, the margins mattered in this election. Last thing I'll talk about quickly is the challenges going forward. So there will be 64 new MSPs in this coming election, in this coming parliament. That is, aside from the first session of parliament, that's unmatched. And it's a huge logistical issue of figuring out how you induct 64 people. Almost half of the MSPs will be new. How do you get them to know how the parliament works, to understand what they're supposed to do, how they hire people, run their offices, and how they engage with parliamentary processes? Combine that with what Nicola has talked about, with there being the second placed parties having an equal number. This causes all sorts of complications. The parliament the conventions of the parliament assume a pecking order: largest party, second largest party, and down. So they're going to have to revisit some of the, possibly some of the standing orders, but certainly the conventions about how the parliament works. Nicola mentioned First Minister's questions, the Parliamentary Bureau, committee allocations, how they assign offices. Offices are a big deal to MSPs, where they sit in terms of real estate in the Parliament. All of that is going to be very important, and I guarantee you those negotiations have already started across the parties and with parliamentary officials. Good thing to know is that the parliamentary officials have been keenly laser focused on the fact that they were going to have a large number of new members, and they've developed a whole program to induct these new members in. Indeed, today will be the first day that all of the just elected members attend Parliament. They'll be getting their badges today, and they'll begin their orientation week today. So it's a very quick turnaround. And they'll be having a variety of social events as well to help them get to know each other and figure out how they're going to work across the aisle. And working across the aisles is going to be important. Cross-party working is going to be important in this upcoming parliament. Looking back to February 2025, so well before the election campaign, we asked members, respondents in Scotland, to people of Scotland, do they like the idea of parties compromising, or do they think that they should be battling it out and standing firm? And it turns out that on average, the people tend to like the idea of compromise. And not surprisingly, this breaks down like we've seen this in other countries. I've done work on compromise in other countries as well. Parties and people who sort of lean center left tend to like the idea of compromise more so than parties and people of center right. So the MSPs are going to be cross-pressured. Some of their constituents are going to want them to compromise. Some of their constituents are going to want them to hold firm. Their parties are going to have different demands on them as well. So it's going to put the MSPs in a difficult position figuring out how they're going to work together, how they're going to conduct the sort of negotiations that they have to work through to make this parliament work and make it productive and make it deliver for the people of Scotland. Right, and that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Lovely stuff, Chris. Thank you. Really struck by some of your final remarks there around the new MSPs arriving in Parliament. I've seen footage this morning of them all turning up at the gates of Holyrood. The Reform group actually all arriving together made quite an impact, a kind of visual impact. And also that point about them spending some time socially together. I've heard a lot of MSPs reflect that because this time in the last session in 2021 was set against the backdrop of the pandemic and people were still socially distancing, the MSPs never really got to meet each other socially, and that had ramifications for the length of the Parliament, where they just couldn't form those initial friendships that could tide them through some of those harder times. So thanks for those reflections. There's lots of questions coming in. I'll bring you back in a moment or two to go through the detail of that. And Mark McGeoghegan did a joint report between Ipsos and the Centre for Public Policy during the short campaign, examining this idea of voting blocks, which explained why voters weren't particularly keen to move too far away from their ideological centres because of what they'd done in the past. Has that work around blocks paid off, Mark? Are you confident that that's what we've seen in the coming days? You've got a presentation for us. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Kez. I'll come on to that in a second. I've got a couple of slides on how the voting blocks have shifted over the course of the campaign and in this election compared to the 2021 election. But I want to start by reflecting on something else that we discussed a lot during the campaign, which was the potential for this to be the most disproportional Scottish Parliament result ever. And indeed, it was the most disproportional Scottish Parliament result ever. We talk about, or certainly there's a narrative that 2011, when the SNP won, that historic majority broke the system, broke the electoral system at Holyrood. But it wasn't much more disproportional than any other Scottish Parliament election, and ranked similarly to the 1999 Scottish Parliament election. But this election has been very disproportional in comparison to past elections in Scotland. What we're looking at here is called the Gallagher Index. This is, I won't go into how it's calculated, but this measures the distance between the vote shares of the parties on the regional list vote and the seat shares that they actually won in the election. So the higher this number, the bigger the distance between the vote shares and the seat shares, and therefore the more disproportional the result of an election. And this election result is by far the most disproportional, and that is a direct result of the SNP winning so many more constituencies than the other parties, despite having such a lower vote share than they have had over the past several election cycles. It's also that, in turn, is a consequence of the fact that there are now more competitive parties in Scottish politics, with the advent of Reform UK as an electorally viable party in a way that the Brexit Party and UKIP never had been in Scotland. We now have six-party politics in the regional list vote, and a combination of five-party and six-party politics in the constituencies. And that means that the proportion of the vote share that you need to win in every constituency in order to win that constituency is lower than it would be if we had, what we used to have, which was essentially a series of SNP versus Conservative or Liberal Democrat or Labour contests, depending where in the country you were. What this means is that we are likely in the future, unless Reform UK suddenly fall off or another party falls off, we're likely in the future, to see more disproportional results in Scottish Parliament elections, but also more unpredictable results, where the margins, the very fine margins, really do matter. And in this election, we had 9 constituencies that were decided by less than 5 percentage points. We had 23 marginal constituencies. And in fact, we had enough constituencies decided by less than 5 percentage points, that actually the distance in terms of the swing from other parties to the SNP, for the SNP to have won a majority in this election, is far smaller than you might have expected, based on the fact that they lost so many votes and they went backwards in terms of their seat numbers. And this raises a question around whether or not the voting system in Scotland is going to continue to be fit for purpose. It's certainly more proportional and more predictable, and better represents the votes of the people of Scotland than, say, first past the post does at the level of the UK overall. And this is not a question that's going to be particularly high up the list of priorities on the agenda for the new Scottish Parliament. But it's certainly something that has to be considered as we go forward, in order to ensure that proportional aspect of the Scottish voting system and the principle that the seat shares that each party has in the Parliament should be roughly representative of their support in the country as a whole, that principle continues to be upheld in future elections in Scotland. So turning to the voter blocks, that piece of work we did during the campaign found that voters weren't particularly willing to switch between their constitutional blocks. If you had voted for pro-independence parties in 2021, you're overwhelmingly more likely to vote for them in 2026. If you'd voted for a unionist party in 2021, you're overwhelmingly more likely to vote for a unionist party in 2026. And that was even when we introduced lots of other variables, lots of other factors like gender and social class and left-right positioning and libertarian authoritarian positioning. When you controlled for all of that, constitutional preference was by far the biggest driver of how Scots intended to vote. Now, if you look at the proportion of the vote share, the vote shares that each bloc takes up, we've seen quite a big change since 2021. So we've seen the independence bloc shrink from 48% of voters to 41% of voters, and the unionist bloc increase from 46% to a pretty comfortable majority of voters, about 54% of voters. That might suggest, at first reading, first glance, that actually voters have been switching between these blocks. Otherwise, how could you have had such a big change? What I would suggest is that perhaps there's been a differential impact of the fall in turnout. Lots of voters who are on the unionist side of the spectrum and have been voting for the Conservatives or Labour over the years and are dissatisfied with Labour, dissatisfied with the Conservatives. They're not about to switch to a pro-independence party, least of all the SNP, who they're also dissatisfied with, had a new party in this election that they could switch their vote to. That's Reform UK. They had an anti-system party that is also pro-union that they could put their vote to, rather than not turning up or spoiling their ballot. That wasn't the case for pro-independence parties. And the fall-off in the size of the pro-independence vote is significantly larger than the fall-off in the total number of votes won by unionist parties in this election. And that does a lot of work explaining why we've seen this change in the makeup in terms of vote shares of the two blocks. What I would want to see going forward, particularly hopefully from the Scottish election study, post-election wave, is whether there's any further evidence we can look at to bear that theory out, or actually has something unexpected happened and we have seen larger than expected switching between the two constitutional blocks. Where we have seen a bit more switching is between the left-right and the left Liberal and the right Conservative blocks. The left Liberal bloc has shrunk significantly compared to 2021. The right Conservative bloc has grown in terms of its share of votes in Scotland, but it's also slightly grown in terms of the total number of votes won by right Conservative parties, despite the fact that turnout was down 10.5 percentage points. Turnout in Scotland in the regional list vote, which is what we're looking at here, was down 409,000 votes, but the right Conservative bloc increased in terms of the number of votes they enjoyed. What I expect this means, and again, we'll see some of this, see some evidence for this, I think, in upcoming surveys, is that we did see quite a lot of, within the unionist bloc, quite a lot of switching from Labour, that should be classed as a left Liberal party, to Reform UK, which should be classed as a right Conservative party. If that's the case, then the results will have borne out what we expected to see in this election, which is voters sticking within their constitutional blocks, refusing to switch between them, but switching between the left Liberal and the right Conservative blocks within those overall constitutional blocks. And that raises big questions for Labour in particular. Nicola touched on this earlier, around how they approach that constitutional conundrum, because most of the left Liberal voters in Scotland are on the pro-independence side of the ledger, not the pro-union side of the ledger. And they're the voters that they need to win over if they're ever going to have a hope of getting back into government in Scotland in future. And just before I hand back to Kez, There's another, I don't have a chart for this, but there's another observation I wanted to briefly touch on, which is the relationship between the Green Party and the Scottish National Party. The SNP swing against the SNP was disproportionately large in this election in constituencies where the Scottish Greens stood. Glasgow South Side in particular, but also Edinburgh Central, saw much bigger swings against the SNP than seats in which the Greens didn't stand. Some of the most marginal constituencies in the country now are Green SNP marginal constituencies, and the Greens have sent a message in this election that they can win constituencies, that their vote for the Greens or the constituency vote is not necessarily a wasted vote. They can win constituency seats in Scotland now. And so that dynamic, how does that affect the dynamic within the pro-independence bloc going forwards, where perhaps going into this election, a lot of pro-independence voters thought, well, it's SNP on the constituency vote, I can go with the Greens in the list vote, that's safer. They're going to be faced with much more of a choice going forward, and that might, again, A, perhaps strain that relationship within the pro-independence bloc, but B, it also raises questions around what does a majority for independence mean going forward? Going into this election, John Swinney said that a majority for the SNP was the only path to an independence referendum based on that 2011 result. But if the Greens are increasingly competitive in the constituencies and are going to be taking constituencies off of the SNP going forward, that majority, as difficult as it already was to win, becomes even more difficult to win going forwards. So what does that mean for constitutional politics over the next Parliament and beyond? I think it's a big question that we're not going to know the answer to for quite some time. Thanks.
Lovely stuff, Mark, there. Particularly interested in the comments at the end there about SNP Green dynamics, and we'll come on to that because I can see we've got some questions coming in from our audience there. It's not too late to ask your question, folks, so please do pop them into the Slido below. We'll get all our speakers back on the screen to start working through some of those questions. Just strikes me though, Mark, looking at the Glasgow Central result actually is an interesting indicator of what happened in Glasgow when you didn't have a Green constituency candidate. An overwhelming result for Alison Fewlis there, with the SNP vote up in Glasgow Central, I think in one of only 2 seats across the country where the SNP increased their majority and their vote share. Then you contrast the Glasgow Central list result where you can see a phenomenal result for the Greens there. So quite clearly people in Glasgow Central were voting Alison Fewlis on the lavender ballot paper and then going for the Greens on the peach more often than not. Welcome back to all 4 of our guests. We've got about 25 minutes for questions. That means you're not all going to get a shot at every question, I'm afraid, so I'm going to direct them from the chair. And if you are desperate to get in on somebody else's question, just indicate in my direction. The most popular question we've got coming in so far, Nicola, is coming your way in the first instance, which is really a reflection on what this all means for the prospect of another independence referendum. We had a commitment from the First Minister to call a vote on his first day in office to start that process. Where does it end?
I don't think he gets to decide. So what are the prospects of an independence referendum now? I think they're exactly the same as the prospects were before the election. And actually, I think that probably would have been the case even if the SNP had have secured a majority. I think what we can perhaps see, and what I think we will see, is more of a push towards questioning those parties who don't favour independence to provide some clarity on what a legitimate process would be. Ultimately, the legal authority lies with the UK Parliament and, by extension, the UK government. So they get to decide when and if a referendum will be held within the process of the Constitution, and the SNP is not interested in, quite rightly in my view, in a referendum that would be otherwise than within the constitutional framework of the United Kingdom. But I think that there is a democratic case to be made. I don't think you're strongest in making it when your vote share is in the 30s, or when the combined vote share of the 2 pro-independence parties is still some way short of an overall majority, but it's still a case that can be made. And I think the symbolic votes in Parliament and the Constitutional Commission will try to advance those sorts of cases and arguments, and I think that's probably the best that we can hope for in this parliamentary session, is that there is a bit of clarity. Of course, there will be a UK general election in this session too, and that would create another political opportunity. But in terms of the legal process, it's the same as it ever was.
Mark, just turning to you, there's been a lot of commentary over the past couple of weeks actually about the falling combined vote share of the two major parties, not just in Scotland but across the UK, with the Conservatives and Tories falling back quite considerably. Do you think we're seeing a rejection of the establishment style parties? Can we see that reflected in the Scottish result?
To an extent, yes. I think it's difficult to make that argument in the Scottish case when we're used to having multi-party politics in Scotland to begin with. That's not a new phenomenon here. Yes, it's more fractured than it used to be in the past, but that's not new. And when we've just re-elected a government to its fifth term. At the same time, you know, I guess that the SNP have always been very good at towing the line between opposition to Westminster government in Scotland. It's a bit more complicated than that. But I certainly think in terms of looking at that unionist bloc of voters, there's a very clear rejection of the traditional unionist parties in Scotland among that voter bloc, with voters moving away from Labour and moving away from the Conservatives towards Reform UK, and in parts of the country towards the Liberal Democrats as well. The rise of the Greens also points towards a greater preference for perhaps more anti-establishment or radical politics than we've had in the past. But I don't think the story is as clear cut around that in Scotland as it seems to be in other parts of the UK.
Thanks, Mark. And to you, Chris, we've got a question here about the extent to which you can foresee the Greens working with the SNP again. I'm conscious that in your slides, you had a bit of detail there about what the public want when it comes to parties working together. Do we have any sense of what Green voters want? Do they want to be alongside the SNP as close to government as possible? Or is there more of a sort of activist protests kind of radical movement going on here? Do we understand it yet?
Well, I think it's actually sort of two questions, right? What do the voters want, and then what do the party leaders and what are the parties going to do in the parliament? So on the voter side, looking at the compromise questions, yes, it's the parties on the left and Greens being one of those. I mean, Lib Dems actually really like compromise. And you might say, okay, this is how you think the parties are going to get something. But even if you sort of control for policy positions and what they think they're going to win, people on the left tend to like the idea of compromise more. But within the parliament, that's a different dynamic. So I can think that the Green Party leaders will probably be keen to try to get their policy priorities on the SNP's agenda. But there's, I think, two important things to consider here with that. One, the SNP's position. And the SNP may well be in a better position than it has been to sort of look for partners on a case-by-case basis, depending on the issues that they're considering. So you might think, for instance, that the Lib Dems might be a more attractive party to work with on the budget because they might not have as expensive demands when, you know, we know that the fiscal issues are going to reign supreme in this parliament. So, you know, you might think that the SNP is going to sort of pick and choose its partners on that basis. And then on the other side, if we think of the Greens, Reform, and Labour, those parties may have those party leaders may have a bit of a harder time, kind of Nicola gestured toward this previously, they may have a harder time keeping their coalitions together, which is going to make negotiation and compromise tricky and even more difficult to do. You know, the Greens it was widely reported they were having some internal disagreements before the elections as a party. The Reform, you know, this group is not used to working together. These are all new people. Some of them apparently have different issue priorities even within the party. So how is that going to work out? And Labour, well, we know the situation with Labour as well, that there's disagreements within the Labour camp as well. So keeping the opposition parties together and operating as negotiating blocs is probably going to be difficult within the parliament itself. But I would come back to, absolutely negotiation and compromise is going to be important in this Parliament if the Parliament is going to be successful in addressing some of the complicated issues it has to address.
Nicola, I'm going to stake a bold claim for the Centre for Public Policy and say it was us that came up with the title, the Meh election, because I think it was first referenced in the podcast that yourself and Chris Burt did, which people can listen back to. And that was around the time that the manifestos all came out. And there was just that sense at the time that there was this gaping distance between the kind of ambition in the manifestos and the fiscal reality facing the Parliament over the next 5 years. Got a couple of questions coming in here about the absence of discussion to date about those fiscal pressures, and really, what could practically happen now to bring about some honesty about the difficult policy decisions ahead, because we all understand that efficiency savings just aren't going to cut it, right? So what happens next?
So we had a fuller discussion on this in our podcast that we recorded this morning. So if people want to listen into that, and in particular listen to Graham Roy's view on that as head of the Fiscal Commission, you can do so for Wednesday. But I mean, so there was the budget and the longer term plan published earlier in the year. So we're not expecting anything to change imminently, not least because so much of the Scottish Government's budget is still dependent on the UK government budget. So there's still that sort of interaction between the cycles. But that's probably more for the year-on-year things. We still know that there are longer-term challenges that are in part related to differences in the development of the Scottish economy from the UK economy, differences in the uptake of social security, differences in public policy choices that mean there is a gap between, and when people talk about a gap, it's a gap between the fiscal transfers and the expectations of what can be raised and the spending commitments. And what we saw in the campaign was more spending commitments, but not really much discussion at all about what would happen because the Scottish Government has no option but to balance its books. So if it is making more spending commitments, that money has to be coming from somewhere. And we will, I think, start to see debates in Parliament that scrutinise a little bit more where the resources are coming from. Over the longer term, in terms of the longer term challenges, I suppose my worry is that it's too treat on the short term and defer consideration of the longer term. Parliament can play a role there if it wants to adopt a constructive role that is perhaps more future thinking. The Welsh Parliament, the Senedd and the Welsh Government have future generations perspective, so that everything has to be looked at for its impact on future generations. We could do that. That is also in the fiscal sustainability space as well as the prevention space. Prevention, I think, is key to thinking about fiscal sustainability as well, because so much of the resource is on servicing failure, servicing illness, servicing things that go wrong. If we can have interventions earlier that prevent those problems from emerging that need to be financed, then that will be helpful in the longer term to fiscal sustainability. We are a long way from that, but I think Parliament and government have a role to play, as do all of the rest of us that are engaging in scrutiny too.
Another thing that Graham Roy mentioned in the podcast this morning was a really strong legacy report from the last Finance Committee of the Parliament that made lots of recommendations around how to future-proof or think about sustainability in new ways going into this Parliament. I think that's one that definitely needs to come off the shelves and be read by all new members thinking about the next parliamentary term. Chris, a question here for you in the first instance about your early thoughts on the effects of this result overall on nationalism generally, and particularly around SNP losses in urban areas, and whether there's any sort of challenge to the SNP in terms of its civic nationalism. We heard from Nicola earlier about the move away from the SNP in the Borders and the Highlands and Islands. What does this tell us about the evolving SNP?
Yeah, I guess to some extent it does depend on what we're talking about when we talk about nationalism. In Scotland, there's always a debate about what exactly that is. Is that support for independence, or is that something else, sort of another sort of more affective sort of position. Now, we know two things here. One is that the support for independence generally does run higher than support for the SNP. And if we go back to the 2011 election, that's where we sort of really came out with a vote for the SNP is not a vote for independence, because we had people voting for the SNP who didn't support independence in that election. And so we've sort of come around now where we have people who support independence who don't vote for the SNP. So they are distinct, and we should be careful about wrapping them together too closely in how we think about it. And then looking at the urban-rural distinctions, it's quite interesting, because with the Scottish election study, since we have 4,000 respondents, that's a pretty big survey, and it's sort of allows us to start to look at the differences between urban and rural people across Scotland and where their policy positions are. And it just so happens that I started to look at that over the weekend, because I thought that would be something I could discuss in this webinar. But the differences weren't what I sort of expected, and certainly what I didn't expect from previous surveys, is that I could find very few policy differences in terms of policy positions between urban and rural people. Now, I think the post-election questionnaire will actually let us have more leverage on it, because we can do more with the ideology sort of things that Mark was talking about previously. But where there is the difference is this idea that the SNP does seem to be, much like the Greens, more of the urban parties, and the other parties tend to be supported more favorably in rural areas. So it's interesting that there's not the big policy differences, yet there's the differences in voting behavior for the parties. And I think that's where there's going to be some interesting work to be done to sort that out. And as I say, once we have the post-election survey, that's actually one of the big questions I want to get on to pretty much as soon as the data are on my computer.
Thanks, Chris. Mark, the next question is for you, and it's clearly from somebody who's been reading your Ipsos report very closely and is very, very interested in the block dynamics that you've been talking about. So bear with me whilst I get this one out into the ether. And it's about that left Liberal block slide. So if we're seeing swings from left Liberal Union parties, and in particular Labour, to right-wing Conservative parties like Reform, then is that measuring of the 2021 support for Labour as a left Liberal bloc a mismeasure, or something else going on here? Are Labour to Reform voters leaking because Labour is losing its socially conservative voters? Or another proposition, are the previous Labour voters who are now Reform voters changing their attitudes? What's going on in this vote switching? Do we understand it yet?
I think there are open questions that we need to dig into here, now that we're going to be getting some post-election data that we can actually compare to the 2021 election and the post-election data there. What I would say is that we're talking about kind of two distinct things here. One is, what are the attitudes of voters, and the other is, which of the blocks do the parties fit into? So Labour fit into the left Liberal bloc because that's the classification of that party. But we know that there are people who are conservative, socially conservative, who vote for Labour, and that's always been the case. And in fact, the Labour movement in the UK has a long-standing reputation as being one of the more socially conservative Labour movements across Europe. And so, yeah, it's perfectly reasonable to say maybe Labour are losing some more socially conservative voters to Reform UK, and that's something that we need to dig into. It's equally likely that they're losing voters to Reform UK because of the performance of the UK government, in part as well, because they don't want to then jump to the Greens because they're not that left-leaning. Maybe they are a little bit more centre right-leaning. So that's the dynamics there, and the relationship between voter attitudes and which of the blocks they've voted for is not a particularly straightforward one. It's a bit complicated. A good example of this is that the SNP, certainly in that report, the data we used for that, 28% of SNP supporters in that data set fell on the more socially conservative side of the spectrum. And one of the points we made in that report was that perhaps the reason that they're sticking with the SNP and the SNP's vote seems to have a bit of a floor is that there's no pro-independence Conservative Party, right Conservative Party, for them to go to, whereas in the union, within the unionist bloc, you have parties on either side of the spectrum that voters can switch between.
Okay, we've got 5 minutes left, Mark.
Yeah,
so I'm
what I
going to
wouldn't
stop
say
here.
is that they're not changing attitudes, right? Voter behaviour is downstream of their attitudes and values. So I wouldn't say that's happening.
We could rule that out at this stage. Right, we've got about 5 minutes left. I've got 5 questions, so I'm going to see if we can get through them. It'll be a hell of an effort if we can. So first one to you, Chris. Do you think SNP members are happy enough with the performance of John Swinney and that he can continue as a party leader for the entirety of the next Parliament?
At this stage, I think it is pretty much up to John Swinney, if he continues on or not. The pre-election survey seemed to indicate that SNP voters are happy enough with the SNP. They rated the party, the previous government as doing reasonably well. It was their preferred option that there amongst SNP voters that there was a SNP majority. Their second preferred option was SNP minority. So yes, I think that SNP voters are at this stage reasonably happy. So I'm trying to keep it short, so I'm going to stop there, but move on.
Great. Nicola, one for you. It's a bit unfair, but is Liam MacArthur the front runner to be presiding officer? Do we know yet? And perhaps more broadly, how important is that role to the functioning of Parliament?
Was that asked by Liam MacArthur? I don't know.
It's actually,
no, I mean, I think he probably is if he wants it. I don't know Liam MacArthur. I have no idea if he wants it. I think it's safe to assume that it won't be someone from Reform or Labour, because the presiding officer is then impartial and they won't want to lose a member of their parliamentary group. So if he wants it, probably it will have to be the presiding officer is voted in a secret ballot by Parliament, so they will have to earn the trust of parliamentarians. There may be multiple contenders, in which case that it's a longer election with numerous rounds potentially. But it's one thing I would say is it's always a really important role. It may be a particularly important role in this election, given how fractured the Parliament and how diverse the Parliament is and how many new parliamentarians there are.
And another quick one for you, Nicola, just with an eye to Wales. How much attention do you think there is at a UK Labour government level about the result in Scotland and in Wales together in the context of the future of the Union?
I think, sorry, I lost you there, but yes. I mean, I think that there's a bit of attention to that, but the UK Labour government is so swamped with its own challenges that are more immediate than that. But I think it will, and it's a little bit early to see how the election, as we expect of a Plaid Cymru government, will affect the relationships and the dynamics of intergovernmental relations. Plaid won't want to push the independence agenda, certainly not in the early period of its administration. It didn't campaign on that. It campaigned very much on cost of living crises, and support for independence in Wales is a lot lower than it is in Scotland. But nonetheless, this is now an ally of the Scottish government. Previously, the SNP government and the Welsh government were very close in intergovernmental relations. They did have common cause quite often, especially in the Brexit period. But I think we'll see that even more. Whether it will lead to greater concessions from the UK government, well, who knows?
Chris, one for you, the penultimate question about compromise and the extent to which political parties should fear it from their own electoral bases. So do we think the Met election attitude will mean no one will remember or notice or care about promises made? Does that mean it's easier to make compromises?
It probably buys the party leaders a little bit of leverage. I think James Mitchell wrote a piece in the Times basically saying, SNP can now chuck whatever it said it was going to do because it's going to have to compromise, and it makes it easier to go back on pledges if you say, well, I'm doing it because I have to form a compromise with somebody else. So you might think that it buys more degrees of freedom for the parties to work around on that. But the electorate does pay attention, and they do pay attention to what the parties are doing, and they will expect the parties to act in a reasonable manner. I think that's one of the sort of things, the narratives coming out of this is, given all the challenges that we've been talking about, people are going to look for the parties to sort of act like the grown-ups in the room, and actually try to work together to solve some of these major fiscal problems that you were talking to about Graham.
Lovely, thank you. We're not going to have time for the final question, but I think it stands as a really nice point to close. And it's just on this idea that reform, if they feel shunned by others, that might make them more likely to be disruptive and therefore become an even greater power undermining devolution. So a bit of a trap there, actually, in the early days of the Parliament. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Huge thank you to our guests here for the reflections and insights today. This concludes our special election 2026 webinar series here at the Centre for Public Policy. You can find recordings of all our webinars, as well as our blogs and policy insights, on the Centre for Public Policy website. Don't forget to listen in to that Spotlight podcast that will be available on Wednesday morning. That's with Graham Roy and Kate Higgins, on a bit more of a public policy focus on what's going to happen next for the government. Thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to keeping in touch. Bye for now.